I still hear it the same way. That pounding on my front door, not a knock, not a normal knock, but the kind of violent, rhythmic thunder that turns your blood cold before your brain even catches up. And then the wood cracked, the lock gave, and my door swung open like it had been attacked by a battering ram. 3 men in matching polos and cheap authority rushed into my house shouting, "You're in violation," like they were police, like they had a warrant, like my home was somehow their property now. I'm Grant Mercer, and before you ask, yeah, I've seen criminals, real ones. I spent 35 years as a criminal defense attorney across 3 states. I've stared down people who thought intimidation was a religion. I've cross-examined liars who could smile while ruining lives. I've watched prosecutors play games with evidence and watched juries try to decide what truth costs. And that's exactly why this moment hit me so hard. Because I recognized the tone immediately, the tone of men who think rules are a weapon, not a responsibility. I bought my modest little place in Amberglow Meadows last spring because I wanted peace, quiet streets, reasonable prices, a decent garage with enough space for my Harley and for my friends to drift in on weekends. Just 8 retired professionals in our late 50s and 60s, leather jackets, harmless jokes, and enough life experience to know when someone is trying to bully you. We call ourselves the Iron Howl Riders, not because we're dangerous, but because the open road still makes us feel alive, and after decades of work we wanted a simple rhythm: wrench a little, grill a little, laugh a little, go home before midnight. Nothing rowdy, nothing illegal, just old men refusing to disappear. The realtor mentioned an HOA like it was a footnote, said it was only there to keep people from painting houses neon green or letting grass grow wild. I signed without overthinking it. And that was my first mistake. Because in Amberglow Meadows the HOA wasn't a neighborhood committee, it was a personal kingdom ruled by a man named Clifford Vance, a former middle manager who'd been downsized years ago and had apparently decided the universe owed him a crown. My first encounter with Vance happened 3 weeks after I moved in. He appeared at my doorstep with a clipboard and a permanent frown. He didn't even introduce himself properly, just started reading violations like he was calling out crimes. My garage door was the wrong shade of beige. My mailbox didn't match the approved design. My trash cans were visible too long, which really meant I brought them in at noon instead of the exact minute the truck rolled away. I tried to be reasonable. I repainted, replaced, complied, because I told myself this was normal HOA nonsense, annoying but manageable. Then the notices kept coming: hedges 2 inches too tall, a bird feeder attracting nuisance wildlife, and my Harley, my pride, my symbol of freedom, was labeled an eyesore that should be kept inside at all times. Each notice came with a fine. Each fine grew like it was being fed, and one Saturday, while we were working on a bike in my garage, I told Judge Everett Lane, the former state Supreme Court judge in our group, that this was getting ridiculous. He didn't laugh the way I expected. He just took a slow sip of beer and said, "Careful. I've seen HOAs go rogue. They start small. They push until you either bleed money or you leave, and they count on you being alone when you fight back." That same evening, while we were enjoying a perfectly legal backyard barbecue, 3 men in enforcement polos appeared at my fence, cameras out, clipboards up, not a greeting, not a request, just documentation like we were a crime scene. One of them told me gatherings were limited to 6 people without prior approval. I looked at my 7 friends and smiled and said something dumb, something casual. "We're just old guys with motorcycles." And I didn't realize that sentence was the spark that lit the war. Within weeks, fines started landing weekly. Motorcycle parked in driveway more than 3 hours. Curtains not conforming to approved pallet. Wind chime causing noise disturbance. And by the time I tried to attend the HOA meeting to dispute it, Vance had a convenient rule that residents with outstanding violations could observe but not speak, like a courtroom where the defendant isn't allowed to open his mouth. Then I met Eleanor Price, a widow across the street, sitting on her porch with trembling hands staring at a letter, and when I asked if she was okay, she looked up with tears and whispered, "They're going to take my home," because the HOA fees had tripled and the fines had piled up, and now the HOA was threatening a lien for nearly $5,000. Violations like decorations outside the approved window, unauthorized plant species, failure to power wash quarterly, absurd little rules, turning into a real threat. And I felt something shift inside me, because I didn't retire to watch predators hunt the elderly with paperwork. That night, I called an emergency meeting in my garage. I showed the letter to the Iron Howl Riders, and I said it out loud. This isn't just about me anymore. This is a pattern, and they're targeting the people least able to fight back. Our tech guy, Miles Cade, a retired FBI cyber specialist, offered to dig into HOA records, because HOAs are required to keep public records, and our finance brain, Darren Holt, a former Fortune 500 CFO, said he'd analyze whatever we found, and within a week the numbers started screaming. Fees up 300% in 2 years, no meaningful improvements, reserves ballooning, financial statements vague to the point of comedy, and then Miles discovered emails tucked behind the HOA's web portal, conversations between Vance and consulting companies about special projects residents had never heard of. While I was reviewing that, a certified letter arrived fining me $5,000 for operating a commercial enterprise, meaning my weekend gatherings, with an ultimatum to pay, relocate, or face enforcement action. And for 2 months, I tried to be the reasonable one, but the fine was the last straw, and what happened next was the line they never should have crossed. On Miles's advice, I installed security cameras, nothing fancy, just enough to document harassment, and one Tuesday afternoon while I was volunteering at a local veterans center, my phone buzzed with an alert. 3 HOA enforcement officers were picking my lock, entering my home, and staying nearly 20 minutes, rummaging through my belongings, photographing everything, removing items from my garage like they owned it. I called the police and raced home, and when I arrived, Officer Nolan Reyes was standing there looking uncomfortable while the HOA men were still in my garage. They told him they had authorization to inspect in emergencies, pointing to some clause in the HOA covenant, and my heart dropped when I saw my tools scattered, empty spaces where personal items had been, and worst of all, a fresh scratch gouged into the fuel tank of my Harley, like someone had taken a blade to my retirement promise. I told Reyes it was breaking and entering, property damage, theft. I demanded arrests, and the lead goon, Troy Maddox, smirked and waved a paper like it was sacred, claiming emergency inspection authorization because my so-called illegal business was an emergency. Reyes tried to call it a civil matter, suggested I consult an attorney, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was insane, and I told him, calmly, that no HOA agreement overrides state law. No private group has the right to enter a residence without permission or a court order, period. And I also told him I'd file a formal complaint if these men weren't at least detained while he investigated the break-in that was clearly captured on my cameras. That evening, my daughter Tessa Mercer, a practicing attorney, drove in furious, reviewed the covenant clause, and explained exactly what I already knew in my bones. Those emergency clauses are meant for real emergencies, water leaks, structural hazards that threaten adjacent homes, not enforcement of petty rules about friends eating burgers. And even then, removing items is theft, plain and simple. I called the Iron Howl Riders into my living room, the mood heavy, and I said, they crossed the line. This isn't about petty rules anymore. This is about lawlessness, intimidation, and vulnerable residents being squeezed until they lose their homes. And Darren added that the HOA financials had huge discrepancies, money funneled to consulting companies with no clear records, amounts big enough to be criminal. And Judge Everett Lane finally spoke, quiet and sharp. We activate Operation Paper Trail, and I'll make some calls. 8 old men, 400 years of combined experience, law, finance, security, tech, landing a counteroffensive at a kitchen table like we were prepping for a heist. Except we weren't stealing, we were taking back truth. We requested 5 years of HOA financial records under state law. Vance tried to stall, claimed audits, but Tessa sent a letter citing statutes that made him fold fast. And what we found was classic fraud language, community enhancement consulting, regulatory compliance management, vague corporate fog, monthly payments to companies with glossy websites and empty substance. And Miles dug deeper and found all 3 companies tied to the same P.O. box, and the incorporator name on every filing was Dana Vance, Clifford's wife. Then a county clerk, someone Everett knew from old cases, slipped us a folder showing a developer entity, Amber Glow Horizon LLC, had been quietly buying homes whenever liens forced foreclosures, 7 homes in a year, mostly elderly residents who couldn't keep up with escalating fees. And the picture snapped into focus. Vance wasn't just power tripping. He was orchestrating a system to force vulnerable homeowners out, then sell their homes into a developer pipeline. We decided to confront the HOA office, not violently, not illegally, just a formal show of solidarity and a documented request. And when we arrived on our bikes, 8 aging men in leather jackets who looked intimidating until you noticed reading glasses and gray hair, we found the office oddly fortified, private security outside, windows covered, like someone was hiding. And that's when a young woman approached, nervous, eyes flicking around. She introduced herself as Kara Wynn, Vance's assistant, and she whispered that she wanted to help. She'd been forced to sign backdated approvals for fee increases never voted on. She couldn't stomach what they were doing to people like Eleanor Price, and she pressed a key into my hand, telling me it opened a file cabinet in Vance's office marked Special Projects, and she'd make sure cameras were off Sunday evening. Right as we were organizing the coalition, I came home one afternoon and saw my door frame splintered, the front door hanging open, and inside Maddox and 2 goons were carrying my television toward the exit, claiming enforcement action and confiscation of property of equivalent value. And when I snatched their so-called warrant, I saw it immediately, not court-issued, just a homemade document with the HOA logo and Vance's signature, and I told them, deadly calm, they were committing theft and burglary, and I called 911, and I said, loud enough for them to hear, I wasn't sure if they were armed. That one sentence changed everything, because it forced a priority response. Within 20 minutes, the Iron Howl riders arrived, 7 Harleys pulling in like thunder, parking in a semicircle that boxed the goons' vehicles, not touching them, not threatening them, just making it impossible to pretend this was a private little intimidation. And when Officer Nolan Reyes came back, he didn't have the luxury of calling it civil anymore. Forced entry, witnesses, fake warrant, stolen property. And my camera footage, he took statements, documented everything, and while he stopped short of arresting them on the spot, he warned them an investigation was coming. And as they slunk away, I leaned close to Maddox and told him, quietly, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. That night, I couldn't sleep. The broken door frame stared at me like a wound, and I understood something I'd spent decades explaining to juries. Home invasion changes you, even when it's nonviolent, because it steals safety. And in the morning, I ran my hand over the scratch on my Harley's tank, and I felt righteous anger bloom. Not rage for revenge, but anger for the principle, because my bike represented freedom, and Vance was trying to turn freedom into a permission slip. We launched Phase 2. Miles built a site called Amberglow Meadows Truth. We posted documents, timelines, videos, and resident stories. Tessa prepared a class action lawsuit. Darren built a financial analysis showing millions potentially diverted through shell vendors. And Sunday night, with Kara Wynn's help, Judge Everett Lane and I accessed the file cabinet in Vance's office. Inside was the mother lode, development plans for Amberglow Skyline condos, projections showing how many homes could be acquired through liens and foreclosures, target lists of residents, including Eleanor Price flagged as priority because of limited resources, and I felt my stomach drop because now it wasn't just corruption, it was systematic cruelty. Wednesday morning, we went public. 30 motorcycles showed up because the Iron Howl riders called in veteran friends. We lined the strip mall outside the HOA office, engines idling, not a threat, a statement. News vans arrived tipped off by a reporter Lena Hart. Residents gathered, curious, desperate. And when Clifford Vance finally emerged pale and shaking, I rode forward with a bullhorn and told the crowd who I was, what I'd seen, and what we'd found. I held up copies, financial documents, target lists, the development plans, and I said this stops today. We demand resignation, a full audit, and new elections under independent oversight. The crowd found its voice, stories poured out, elderly residents threatened, young families hit with surprise assessments, approvals mysteriously denied for longtime owners, while developer-friendly requests sailed through, and Vance tried to spin it as troublemakers, but the evidence was louder than his mouth. That's when the twist punched in. The local police captain, Captain Harold Bryce, arrived and acted like Vance's bodyguard, ordering dispersal, threatening arrests, not even pretending neutrality. And it felt like watching a dirty case from my old courtroom days, power shielding power, and I realized this wasn't just one HOA tyrant, it was a network. We left in formation, engines roaring, not retreating, repositioning. And that night Lena Hart's expose ran. And by morning the story was everywhere. State officials started asking questions. Vance panicked, shredded papers, issued cease and desist letters, tried to paint us as a gang. But we had already delivered a complete evidence package directly to the district attorney, bypassing the police chain of command. The pressure broke the dam. The state attorney general announced an investigation. Property transfers linked to Amberglow Horizon LLC were reviewed, and Captain Bryce was placed on administrative leave when reporters discovered he wasn't just helping. He was financially connected to the developer pipeline. 3 weeks later, indictments came down: fraud, embezzlement, elder abuse, conspiracy, and the foreclosure machine collapsed when courts ruled the underlying debts were built on illegally imposed fines, meaning the liens and transfers were rotten at the core. Eleanor Price kept her home. Families who'd been pushed out received compensation from seized assets, and Amberglow Meadows restructured its HOA into something sane. Transparent budgets, term limits, and rules that actually served safety instead of ego. 6 months later, we held the biggest neighborhood barbecue anyone had seen, and when Eleanor handed me a cold drink and told me she thought she'd have to break a promise to her late husband because of daffodils not being on an approved list, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any courtroom win, because this wasn't just a case. It was a community waking up. I didn't join the new board. I didn't need another title. I just wanted my garage back, my bike, my friends, and the sound of a neighborhood that wasn't afraid anymore. And when I look at the repaired door frame, the one they tried to turn into a symbol of their power, I think about the truth that scares bullies the most. People only stay trapped when they feel alone. The second they unite, the game changes. Now let me ask you something. Honestly, when a private group uses rules to extort money, invade homes, and push the elderly toward foreclosure, and the only way to stop it is to expose them publicly and hit back with every legal weapon you have, is that justice? Is that revenge? Or is it simply what happens when people who know the law refuse to be quiet for the comfort of the powerful?